Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into source material that explores some, well, fundamental concepts for building a just state and society.
And this isn't just one narrow view, right? The source really pulls from a vast range of perspectives, philosophy, history, different governance models.
Yeah, and even insights from areas you might not expect, like science and psychology.
Absolutely. So think of this deep dive as helping you unpack the proposed building blocks for a truly just system, at least as presented in this material.
We're looking at ideas from the individual level, how a person functions justly.
All the way up to the national, and even some pretty surprising cosmic connections the source makes.
Our goal today is really to extract the most important nuggets, the key ideas, the core principles, and some of those surprising links.
So you can quickly grasp what this material is highlighting as essential for achieving justice.
Okay, let's get into it then. The source kicks off right away by putting a spotlight on a really crucial foundation for a just state: the need to elevate reason over emotion.
That's right. The argument laid out here is that reason provides, well, impartiality, clarity. It helps cut through bias, fosters deeper understanding.
Which are presented as basically non-negotiable for effective just governance.
And the contrast is drawn pretty starkly with emotions. They're seen as inherently tied to subjective viewpoints, which can then breed conflict.
Lead to inefficiency, and generally create instability and stress within the way a state is run.
So a state that is truly guided by reason, according to this material, is one that can maintain well-considered laws, diligent processes.
And that deliberate, rational approach is what builds stability and, ultimately collective well-being.
You can see this play out, can't you? I mean, we've all seen political systems where decisions seem driven purely by emotional rhetoric or maybe narrow partisan interests.
Right, and the source points out how that often leads to policies that just don't work efficiently. They create widespread public discontent.
Now, shifting focus slightly from the state's structure to the fabric of society itself, the material lays out several foundational principles for a just society.
It starts with affirming the absolute dignity, equality, freedom, and inherent worth of every single individual.
And this holds true. The source really stresses this. Regardless of anyone's identity, their class, or their circumstances, it's universal.
And it introduces a really interesting concept here: gun karma equity.
Yeah, that one's interesting. It's not framed as entitlement, like getting something for nothing. It's presented as social justice achieved through empowerment.
So the idea is to create an environment where people have the opportunity to thrive based on their actions, their effort.
Fostering growth, harmony, and stability, it connects individual action to societal outcomes.
A core principle linked to that is the notion that challenges and rewards should, in an ideal just society, be the same for everyone.
And the law is seen as having a very specific role in this. It should be designed to empower the weak,
while simultaneously controlling the potential overreach of the strong. A balancing act.
which makes sense, right? And tied to that, individuals must have robust rights, specifically the right to constitutional remedies if they're wronged, and protection against exploitation.
Achieving all this means ensuring fairness runs deep, systemically, through all institutional layers: legal, economic, social, political.
Systemic fairness is absolutely crucial. It can't just be superficial.
And something that probably resonates with everyone listening: a corruption-free environment is presented as totally essential for any kind of growth.
Yeah.
You can't build on a rotten foundation.
Exactly. And the Constitution itself, in this vision, should actively reward virtue and talent while also setting clear limits on non-virtuous behavior.
So it encourages innovation, personal responsibility,
Yes.
shapes behavior in a positive direction.
Pulling all that together, the source concludes that building this kind of just society isn't simple. It demands pretty significant structural reform.
And that reform has to be anchored firmly in the rule of law, principles of equity, genuine democratic participation, and fundamental human rights. Those are the bedrock.
So based on that foundation, let's dive into some of the key pillars the source outlines for this just society. The first one is the rule of law and ensuring judicial integrity.
A legitimate legal framework is, well, the bedrock here, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this requires an independent and truly accountable judiciary, plus ensuring everyone has genuine access to justice.
And importantly, holding institutions themselves accountable under the law, not just individuals.
Right. And there's a strong emphasis on what the justice system should actually aim for, moving beyond just punishment towards rehabilitation and reconciliation.
Okay, next pillar: social equity and human rights.
This one's all about protecting and promoting equal rights for everyone. It means policies that actively work to dismantle barriers like discrimination or disparities in resources.
And it means specifically supporting marginalized groups.
Mhm. The broader goal for societal progress here isn't just about economic indicators like GDP growth. It's about fostering a society where virtue, talent, and excellence can actually flourish.
Then there are the economic principles highlighted. First, the importance of living wages.
Yeah, ensuring minimum wages are actually sufficient to meet basic living costs and allow for a, dignified standard of living, not just survival.
And linked to that, progressive taxation and wealth redistribution.
The source sees equitable tax structures and strong public funding for essential services, things like healthcare, education, as key mechanisms to reduce inequality.
Which brings us naturally to universal basic services.
This concept goes beyond just funding. It frames guaranteed access to essentials, healthcare, education, legal aid, clean water as fundamental human rights, not privileges.
Democratic participation is another crucial pillar identified.
The source emphasizes the need for inclusive democracy, where every citizen genuinely has a voice. And this isn't just about voting every few years.
Right. It's the opportunity to influence and participate in how their constitution and governance systems evolve over time.
This flexibility allows the system to adapt as society changes with new technology, cultural shifts, or global events. It has to be dynamic.
The source points to examples of how this can work, like maybe using digital platforms for transparent governance, perhaps something like Estonia's well-known open data system.
It also talks about decentralization, distributing power to local governance, or even citizen assemblies, giving people more direct say.
And freedom of the press is specifically called out here.
Yes, as a critical check on power and a vital channel for public discussion and debate, essential for accountability.
Education and empathy are also presented as essential for cultivating civic consciousness and mutual respect.
This includes things like civic education early on, teaching critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and really understanding the Constitution.
And cultural dialogue, actively encouraging understanding between different faiths and cultures. The source mentions Singapore's Racial Harmony Day as a kind of practical example.
Now, the source is careful to state that achieving this kind of just society isn't some impossible utopia. It's framed as a viable aspiration.
But one that demands sustained reform, ethical leadership, and really active civic engagement from everyone. It's not passive.
It even brings in that famous quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice."
A powerful quote.
And the source immediately follows that by adding a crucial point, that bending happens through collective action. It's not automatic. People have to bend it.
Right. And finally, under these pillars, there's the concept of righteousness.
The idea that knowledge and policy must be fundamentally grounded in truth and ethics, promoting equity and harmony. It's about the quality of the knowledge used.
The example given for righteousness is climate change policy, suggesting it should integrate science, yes, but also philosophy, spiritual values, maybe even religious ethics. A holistic approach.
Okay, now, here's where, as you said, it gets really interesting and perhaps a bit more philosophical. The source introduces a principle that acts as a kind of overarching framework, the microcosm-macrocosm principle.
Right. This is the idea that a truly just state and society should, in some fundamental way, mirror the structure and harmony found within the individual person.
And maybe even the cosmos itself. It's a big analogy.
It pulls in Plato's concept of justice first. He saw justice in the individual when reason governs, the spirit supports it, and appetite is controlled, internal harmony.
And he paralleled this in the state with different groups fulfilling roles. Guardians ruled, that's reason, auxiliaries defended spirit, and producers sustained appetite, balance.
And the source highlights that Indian philosophy has a remarkably similar ancient principle, yat pinde tat brahmande.
Which translates roughly to, as is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. The internal, like the soul, reflects the external cosmos. Same core idea.
And it draws direct parallels between Plato's idea of soul faculties and Indian ones. Viveka, or discernment, is like Plato's reason.
The mind is like the spirit, and the indriyas, our sense organs, are like the appetite. Similar structures.
This analogy extends further. It connects Plato's tripartite state to the traditional Indian Chaturvarna system.
Yeah.
Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras.
Right, the thinkers, educators, warriors, rulers, merchants, farmers, and laborer service providers. The source argues justice in both frameworks requires cooperation among these parts, guided by reason or intellect from that top tier.
And this microcosm analogy, the source argues, doesn't just stop at individuals or ancient states. It can even apply to collective entities today, like corporations or the UN, or even nations.
They can behave, in a sense, like unified entities or maybe superorganisms, acting with a kind of collective mind.
And interestingly, the source points to modern research that seems to touch on similar ideas, though maybe not using that ancient language.
Yeah, things like organizational psychology, looking at shared cognition and emergent behavior in groups, or swarm intelligence research studying how ant colonies act almost as a single unit.
It mentions Dunbar's social brain hypothesis, Teilhard de Chardin's concept of the noosphere, that layer of collective thought.
And sociological ideas like collective consciousness from Durkheim or Jung's collective unconscious. Echoes of the same concept.
Even how we talk about nations reflects this personification. Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, Hofstede's cultural dimensions.
Or how we use figures like Uncle Sam or the bear in international relations. We treat nations like persons.
So the suggestion from the source is that perhaps the design of a nation's governance structure should deliberately reflect this principle, aiming for balance.
Structuring government to balance economic, social, environmental priorities, much like an individual ideally balances their mind, body, and spirit. It's about internal harmony at the national level.
Though the source does acknowledge that discerning exactly what those cosmic principles are can be elusive, drawing on deep philosophical ideas like Plato's form of the good or the Samkhya concepts of Purusha, Prakriti, and Mahat, it's not simple.
Building directly on that microcosm analogy, the source then proposes a specific multi-tiered governance model for a nation designed to reflect this principle.
Okay, so the highest level, Tier 1, represents the very existence of the nation, its core identity.
Yeah, it's likened to the ahamkara, the ego or sense of self, and fundamental being. This tier deals with bedrock issues, constitutional principles.
The analogy connects it to Purusha, consciousness, wisdom, principles, and Prakriti, material-based people, land, resources.
Tier 2 is proposed as the national parliament. Its role, to control the flow and growth of the nation.
This is seen as analogous to the preserver or mover principle like Theos or Vishnu in some traditions, whose essential property is Mahat, or intelligence.
And the source argues this tier shouldn't just be anyone. It should be composed of genuinely wise people selected continuously, perhaps merit-based.
Focusing on high IQ, EQ, strong leadership, relevant experience, and critically, a clear intention focused solely on serving the nation, not personal gain.
And then Tier 3 is the state assemblies, made up of elected representatives. This is where the democratic element comes in more strongly.
This level is analogized to the mind of the universe, Brahman, with each state assembly and its chief minister acting like an individual Brahma, a sort of creator force within its sphere.
This democratic tier represents the jiva, the individual soul or citizen, realizing its connection to the larger self and national responsibility. It brings in creativity, emotions, holistic thinking.
Aligning with the idea of centralized planning, providing direction from Tier 2, maybe, but execution being decentralized at this state level.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look at the modern state through the lens of the sources specifically. What makes it vulnerable or fragile today?
The source identifies several key factors.
One major factor is increased mobility and migration. The source notes this can strain resources, potentially cause cultural tensions, and, present security challenges.
And, perhaps not surprisingly, the communication revolution the internet features prominently.
Right. While it brings instant information, it also means misinformation spreads just as fast, which can seriously destabilize public trust.
Social media in particular is seen as amplifying volatility and division, makes things feel more chaotic.
Then there's resource dependency. Reliance on other nations for essential goods creates vulnerability to sanctions or supply chain disruptions.
And geopolitical vulnerability is key. Interdependence means states can't always act unilaterally. Their decisions have to anticipate how others will react. You're not in a vacuum.
Shared global risks, like climate change or pandemics, demand international cooperation, which is obviously difficult when nations have differing interests or priorities.
The source also dives into foreign interference, describing it as increasingly sophisticated, especially targeting democracies.
Yeah, this includes everything from hacking and funding political groups to spreading targeted disinformation campaigns.
And it introduces the concept of the deep state, as discussed in the source material described as a potentially secret global network, maybe oligarchs.
using influence over financial systems, monetary policy, lobbying, and media to control governments and markets from behind the scenes. It's presented as a concept from the source.
Election manipulation by foreign powers using those tactics, disinformation, hacking, funding, is presented as a direct threat to democratic integrity, undermining the vote itself.
And propaganda specifically designed to amplify existing domestic divisions via social media is another challenge highlighted, pitting groups against each other.
And finally, non-traditional threats from non-state actors, think hackers or proxy groups, are seen as harder to deter and counter compared to traditional military threats, more ambiguous.
Let's circle back now to the idea of justice itself and look at how different philosophical traditions approach it and how that applies to legal systems.
The source connects Plato's concept of justice as harmony with the Indian concept of dharma.
Seeing both as emphasizing right action for the greater good. Though it notes dharma often extends across multiple lifetimes, adding another dimension.
And Plato's analogy of the tripartite soul and state is highlighted again as fitting neatly within that broader macrocosm idea we discussed.
Now, the source makes an interesting, maybe even provocative contrast regarding our modern judicial systems.
How so?
It points out they rely heavily on Greek logic, specifically Aristotelian deduction, that very step-by-step, syllogistic, often binary true-false way of reasoning.
Okay.
It then presents Indian logical principles, particularly in Nyaya, which means analysis, as potentially superior or at least more suitable for legal contexts because of a broader, more flexible approach.
What makes it different?
Well, several things. It includes multi-valued logic, like Syadvada, which acknowledges that truth can be conditional and there can be multiple valid perspectives on an issue. It's not always just black and white.
Right, okay, so less rigid.
Exactly. It also uses a richer set of tools for knowing what they call pramana. This includes not just inference and testimony, like in Western logic, but also direct perception and analogy, a wider epistemological toolkit.
It also emphasizes contextual reasoning, adapting the logic to the specific situation, rather than applying a rigid formula everywhere.
And Tarka, which is debate and dialectics, is built right into the system to encourage analyzing arguments from many angles.
The source also stresses holistic thinking in Indian logic, seeing different aspects of a case or phenomenon as interconnected,
rather than isolating them rigidly like Greek logic sometimes tends to do. And importantly, it has ethical integration incorporating dharma, that sense of ethical duty and cosmic order, directly into the reasoning process.
And the source also briefly touches on manigamanam, described as special techniques potentially based on spiritual principles presented within this framework of Indian thought. Less defined, perhaps.
And interestingly, it discusses the Vedic philosophical view of asat, meaning not true, but capable of existing as a potential root of evil.
How does that relate?
Well, shortcuts, or asteya, which means non-stealing but broadly includes ethical shortcuts, are seen as a manifestation of this evil behavior. Taking the easy path, undermining trust, avoiding the right effort, that's asat in action.
Looking at historical examples, the source discusses traditional Indian justice systems, using the Badal Pachisi stories as intellectual and ethical exercises for rulers like King Vikramaditya.
Right, these stories presented really complex moral dilemmas, ownership disputes, conflicting duties, judging motives, paradoxes designed to test their logic, judgment, and adherence to dharma, like case studies for kings.
It also mentions manigamanam again, this time as an ancient Tamil judicial ritual where the accused would swear oaths before deities or community elders,
with a shared belief that divine forces would intervene to punish falsehoods. The source notes similar practices globally, like West African swearing shrines or indigenous truth-telling traditions. Community and spiritual belief played a role.
And here's where the source brings up some pretty controversial territory, discussing attempts to use non-traditional means in justice or intelligence gathering.
Yes, it mentions instances like law enforcement consulting psychics, citing Gerard Croizet as an example.
And the CIA's Stargate project, which experimented with remote viewing to find things like spy planes or hidden plutonium stashes.
Though the source is careful to note the verification of Stargate results was often questionable, difficult to confirm. It even mentions President Carter being briefed on it.
The source even brings up the possibility of mediums gathering information from spirits, but frames it with a huge caveat, if that could ever be proven reliable, which is, highly debatable.
Exactly. These examples are presented more as historical instances of people trying to seek justice or intelligence through unconventional, often scientifically dubious means. Their efficacy is very much questioned within the source's context.
So, based on the principles of Indian logic, The source then proposes several potential judicial reforms for today.
These include promoting multi-perspective deliberation in courts, really listening to different viewpoints, and explicitly integrating ethics or dharma into judgments, not just applying technical law.
More flexible sentencing focused on rehabilitation is suggested, along with wider use of alternative dispute resolution methods, trying to heal rather than just punish.
Legal education reforms could include incorporating the study of Indian logic alongside Western logic, broadening the toolkit.
There's also the interesting idea of having truly mature judges, perhaps drawing on the wisdom gained during the Vanaprastha ashram stage of life, selecting judges for deep wisdom and moral integrity, not just legal knowledge.
And a concept called involved justice, where judges might actually go to the location of an incident to better understand the context, maybe even assist in the investigation phase, more hands-on.
The Dharma Panchayat is held up as a model here, a non-adversarial system focused on healing and reconciliation, deeply involving community participation.
And the source provides real-world precedents for similar approaches. Navajo Nation peacemaking, Rwanda's post-genocide Gakaka courts, Bhutan's Buddhist mediation traditions.
West African palaver councils, Scandinavian victim offender dialogues, even how elders might help resolve conflicts in urban U.S. gangs. These community-based models exist.
The source ties this back to a fundamental idea about human nature and destiny. Quoting the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, "You are what your deep driving desire is. As your desire is, so is your will. As your will is, so is your deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny."
So connecting the pursuit of justice to the profound act of transforming not just laws, but potentially individual and collective destinies. It's a deep connection.
Moving on to another challenge identified for modern democracy, the source coins a term, democratic amnesia.
Democratic amnesia, what's that?
It's the problem where crucial issues that demand long-term attention, things like failures in legislative oversight, unsustainable welfare programs, important lessons from history, they flare up, grab headlines.
Get everyone talking for a bit.
Exactly, but then they fade away. The systemic problems are left unresolved because the collective memory seems short. Democracy is likened to a lumbering elephant that struggles with recall.
Examples given include how political cycles can prioritize short-term vote bank agendas over long-term stability, how minority appeasements can become entrenched without review,
Or the huge impact of unsustainable welfare schemes like farm loan waivers, which cost staggering amounts, 2.2 lakh crore cited for 2017-23, and strained credit systems, or the financial strain from things like electricity subsidies in Punjab.
And the source notes that painful lessons from past wars or treaties are often unheeded, leading to repeated mistakes.
So the source proposes a pretty unique solution, a National Information Retrieval Establishment, or NIR.
NIRE, what would that do?
This would be an autonomous body specifically designed to act as the state's long-term memory and analytical engine, dedicated institutional memory.
The analogy here, drawing from Samkhya and the microcosm idea again, is that while an individual has internal systems for processing past, present, future, and their body has muscle memory,
A nation lacks a formal, systematic structure for remembering, analyzing, and acting on its own history and data effectively. NIRE would fill that gap.
how would it work? What's the structure?
It would have distinct wings. An archival wing to digitize and preserve vast amounts of records, legislative debates, treaties, policy outcomes, economic data, everything.
An analytical wing using modern tools like data science and AI to identify long-term trends. What were the real impacts of those welfare schemes over 10, 20 years? What patterns emerge from past legislative activity?
And then a crucial advisory wing to synthesize this information and provide clear, concise summaries and actionable insights to the key decision makers: Parliament, state assemblies, the president.
And these insights would flow directly to planning bodies like the Planning Commission or NNEI-IOG, informing future policy.
This system could be integrated into governance in powerful ways, mandating NRE reports for pre-legislative scrutiny, forcing lawmakers to actually look at the historical data and trends before passing new laws.
Using it for continuous debt monitoring or analyzing historical conflict data to perhaps aid prevention strategies, making data useful.
The source points to comparative models, like South Korea's Kippa Institute, which apparently use data analysis to make welfare programs more efficient and reduce redundancy.
Or Estonia's digital governance system, X-Road, enabling real-time data sharing across government for efficiency. Germany's Bundesarchiv aiding accountability in big inquiries like the Wirecard scandal is also cited. There are partial precedents.
Challenges are acknowledged, of course. Data privacy and security are massive concerns. The source suggests mitigation like strong GDPR-like protocols or maybe even blockchain technology for secure records.
Political resistance is almost guaranteed, right?
Very likely. The suggestion is mitigation through a strong, independent, bipartisan oversight structure, perhaps similar to India's Controller and Auditor General, PCK. Funding and capacity building are also issues, suggesting a phased implementation approach.
Ultimately, the source presents NIRE as a proactive, structural step towards a more reflective, accountable democracy, literally building a guardian against forgetting its own past.
It echoes George Santayana's famous warning: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. NRE is proposed as a way to remember.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about culture and tradition and how they fit into this vision of a just society laid out in the source material.
The source argues that culture should be rooted in ancient philosophical traditions, citing things like the Dharma Sutras or the concept of Vishama Dharma.
But crucially, it needs to be dynamic and able to adapt, not frozen in time.
A key principle emphasized here is voluntary adherence. Culture should thrive because people choose to participate and uphold its values, balancing individual autonomy with a kind of collective ethical framework.
The source brings in several core Indian concepts here to illustrate. Purushartha, the four traditional goals of human life.
Paramartha, the ultimate goal, often described as the destruction or cessation of the three types of pains. Adhyatmika, Atipatika, Atitaivika, basically achieving lasting peace or liberation.
Then parakram, which is valor or fearlessness, linked to righteousness. Parashram, diligent work, aligning with the concept of karma yoga. And prem, universal love or compassion.
It also includes the yama system, the 4 stages of life: student, brahmacharya, householder, grihastha, retire, forest dweller, vamprastha, and renunciate, sannyasa, as a cultural framework for individual development across a lifetime.
And Rajdharma, the specific duties and responsibilities of a ruler or leader, focused on ensuring justice and prosperity for the people. It cites historical ideals like Ram Raja or exemplary rulers like Rama, Janak, or Ashoka.
Going back to Paramartha for a second, the destruction of pains. The source links this to the idea that true happiness isn't just pleasure, but the absence of suffering.
Because the soul's true nature is described as Satchidananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. So liberation is seen as the cessation of suffering. The Bhagavad Gita's definition of yoga as a state free from pain fits right in here.
Parakram, fearlessness, is linked not just to bravery, but to living a just life. It's cultivated through things that build physical strength, a sense of duty, maybe exposure to healthy risk sports, adventure training, maybe even military training programs like the NCC.
Parashram, or diligent work, karma, is presented as fundamental. Especially nishkama karma, performing your duty without attachment to the results, just doing the work well.
This diligent effort is seen as the driver of innovation and productivity in society, citing the Green Revolution as a large-scale example of focused, hard work achieving great results.
And Raj Dharma, the ruler's duty, is presented as equally relevant to modern leaders. They must prioritize public welfare above all else.
The source makes an interesting point here. The structure of government might actually be less important than the intentions and actions of its leaders. It references Ashoka's moral reforms as an example of leadership transforming society.
The source uses a patriarchal analogy for the government's role, acting as a wise patriarch, guiding, protecting, and educating citizens.
This immediately highlights the challenge, doesn't it? Balancing necessary regulation with individual freedom.
Exactly. Too much overreach, like heavy-handed censorship, is harmful. But too little oversight, allowing harm to occur through neglect, is also a failure of duty. A middle path is needed.
Examples given include things like the Cinematograph Act providing vigilance over media content, or how public policy shapes our environments, designing public spaces for safety, or developing strategies to mitigate addiction.
Plato's idea of carefully curating societal influences to foster virtue comes up again here, finding relevance in modern policy.
Crucially, though, the source stresses that culture thrives best through voluntary participation, not coercion. Forcing it kills the spirit.
It quotes the Manusmriti saying Dharma is preserved by the wise through gentle persuasion, not force. This reinforces that idea of a middle path ethical guidance provided with clear rationale, allowing individuals to make informed choices.
Challenges for culture are acknowledged too, including superficiality focusing on pomp and show instead of deeper values, and the fact that individuals are naturally at different stages of ethical development, seeking different things from their culture.
Modern challenges like addiction and the constant distraction from instant gratification Those dopamine hits from social media or other sources are specifically called out.
Public policy, in this view, should actively try to steer society away from dependencies. This means thinking carefully about designing public spaces, evaluating and minimizing detrimental foreign cultural elements if necessary.
Limiting addictive behaviors and reducing easy access to sources of what the source calls cheap dopamine, promoting deeper satisfaction.
Cultural evolution is seen as necessary and natural. Traditions must adapt. The Varna system, it argues, should be based on merit and aptitude, not birth. Marriage customs evolve from arranged matches towards self-choice. Adaptation is key.
So, policy implications include rethinking education to focus on dharma as ethical reasoning and critical thinking, rather than just reciting dogma.
It means actively nurturing cultural integrity in a globalized world, carefully evaluating external influences, reinforcing positive traditional values, but not shutting everything out.
And importantly, integrating traditional knowledge systems with modern science where beneficial, not seeing them as mutually exclusive.
The source presents this approach to culture as offering a framework for harmony, one that tries to successfully integrate ancient wisdom with the complexities and challenges of the present day.
It echoes that Rigveda verse. Let noble thoughts come to us from every side. It's about wise assimilation and adaptation, not rigid isolation or blind acceptance.
Okay, moving to another really significant and often contentious area, secularism and national identity.
The source argues for a reimagined approach here, one that tries to truly balance national unity with individual religious freedoms in a very diverse landscape like India's.
It starts by tracing the history of the word secular itself, noting its evolution from simply distinguishing types of clergy in medieval times.
To the modern concept put forward by George Jacob Holyoake in 1851, defining it as a stance based on naturalistic or worldly considerations, not necessarily anti-religious, but separate from specific religious doctrines.
The source then provides that crucial historical context of church and state power struggles, particularly in Europe, starting really in the Middle Ages.
It describes the church as a massive political force through its vast land and wealth, its own court systems, its near monopoly on education, which provided advisors to rulers.
Its role in legitimizing rule through coronations, and even acting as a mediator or instigator in conflicts like the Crusades. Huge influence. The decline of this centralized church influence is detailed through key historical events. The Protestant Reformation fracturing Christendom,
The devastating religious wars that followed, the Peace of Westphalia establishing the principle of cuius regio, eius religio basically, the ruler determines the religion of the state.
the investiture controversy, where states asserted power over appointing church officials, the Avignon papacy weakening papal authority, the French Revolution's strong anti-clerical stance leading to formal separation of church and state in 1905.
And Germany's Kulturkampf, where Bismarck asserted state control over church affairs. A long history of tension, conflict, and eventual separation or state control.
Now, the source contrasts this European experience sharply with Indian traditions. It argues that Dharma historically encompassed various spiritual paths, or panthas.
And the relationship with the divine was often more direct and personal. Authority was typically decentralized among different gurus, philosophical schools, and local customs.
This meant there was less opportunity, historically, for a single religious hierarchy to wield centralized political control in the way that, say, the Catholic Church with the Pope did, or as envisioned in the concept of a unified Islamic caliphate.
Indian religion is presented in this source as historically more focused on private spiritual pursuit and diverse community customs, rather than a monolithic political force.
This historical difference, the source argues, creates a specific tension in India today. The tension between the freedom to practice one's religion and the right to propagate or actively convert others.
Propagation, especially by religions originating outside India, is seen in the source as having the potential to cause social friction, cultural disruption.
Shifts in demographics over time and potentially undermine national unity or even sovereignty. This is presented as a particular concern when propagation is tied to external funding or involves aggressive proselytization tactics.
So the source draws a really key distinction. Freedom to practice means following your beliefs, performing rituals, living your faith peacefully within your community.
The right to propagate means actively seeking to convert others to your faith. The source argues that propagation can become problematic when it's perceived as undermining existing community identity or heritage, or worse, when it serves political ends, internal or external.
Based on this distinction, the proposal from the source is controversial. To
Mm.
curb propagation without curtailing genuine freedom of practice.
This would involve measures like potentially restricting foreign funding, specifically earmarked for religious conversion activities, and ensuring proselytization efforts respect cultural boundaries and sensitivities.
The stated aim is to prevent religion from being misused as a tool for division or furthering external influence within the nation.
This leads directly to the proposed framework the source calls integrative secularism. It has several core principles.
Okay, what?
First, making patriotism the primary religion or loyalty. This means viewing the nation as a mother figure, where patriotism transcends individual faiths, national interests are always prioritized, and citizens feel gratitude for their nation. All religions are expected to support national causes like unity, economic progress, and social harmony.
Second, secularism is defined specifically as vivar, which refers to public dealings or conduct. It's based on the old Roman concept of how you behave in public.
This means absolutely equal treatment for everyone in public life, jobs, services, law, regardless of their religion. It emphasizes distinguishing between panth, one's personal spiritual path, and Burma, the universal cosmic code or shared ethical values. Public policies should be based on universal dharma, not the doctrines of any specific panth.
Third, eliminating the term minority, except strictly within electoral contexts, like after votes are counted for representation purposes.
Before elections and in general public life, the idea is that all citizens have equal rights and responsibilities. No special status based on religion. This aims to foster a culture where diverse modern lifestyles are embraced without religious labels constantly causing division.
Fourth, ensuring freedom of conscience, but not propagation. Individuals are free to practice their faith privately and publicly within their community.
But actively propagating foreign origin religions specifically for conversion would be prohibited to, in the source's view, protect national cohesion. Similarly, no political or radical ideologies that conflict with national interests would be allowed to operate under the guise of religion.
Fifth, implementing a uniform civil code, UCC.
Yes, a minimum common set of civil laws covering key areas like marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption that applies to everyone, overriding existing religion-based personal laws. The source suggests standardizing these civil laws gradually and sensitively.
Sixth, a clear focus on prioritizing loyalty. Family first, then state, then nation.
This means prioritizing loyalty to one's immediate community, state, and the nation as a whole over any potentially conflicting international, political, or religious affiliations. Domestic focus.
This source definitely acknowledges significant implementation challenges for this framework. There would likely be resistance from various religious groups.
It stresses the need for very sensitive implementation, especially for something like the UCC. It suggests information campaigns engaging religious leaders, for example, working with Muslim communities on potentially standardizing core texts or highlighting the health benefits of discouraging practices like cousin marriages as ways to build understanding and consensus.
Government supervision is also proposed for religious groups,
Yeah.
while they would manage their internal religious affairs.
There would be some form of government representation or oversight to ensure accountability, alignment with national goals, and crucially to prevent misuse for political mobilization or radical agendas.
And perhaps most controversially, no tax benefits specifically for religious activities or promotion.
This means no special tax holidays or exemptions just because an organization is religious. They would be taxed like other entities, with the revenue going towards national development.
Finally, religious instruction in minority institutions would still be allowed.
But also under government supervision to ensure the curriculum complies with national values and explicitly excludes any radical or anti-national content, ensuring education promotes unity.
This proposed integrative secularism is certainly a bold, significantly reimagined approach. It clearly prioritizes patriotism and equal public dealings while suggesting specific regulations on religious activity, particularly propagation and finance, for what it perceives as the national good. It's trying to strike a new balance between state oversight and individual freedoms in a very specific context.
Let's turn our attention now to the financial system. The source identifies some pretty deep-seated problems here: pervasive corruption, the existence of black money, parallel and underground economies.
And what it terms a corrupt nexus involving politicians, bureaucrats, and some businessmen, a harmful triangle.
The connection is laid out very clearly. Black money, often originating from bribes or embezzlement of public funds, significantly reduces the government's taxable revenue base. That's the first hit.
This illicit money then flows into parallel or underground economies, enabling activities like smuggling, tax evasion, unreported cash transactions, basically, economic activity hidden from the state.
Both of these, the initial loss of tax and the hidden economy, drain resources that should be available for public services, infrastructure, and national development.
Money laundering is the mechanism used to integrate this illicit wealth back into the legal economy, making it look legitimate, often via shell companies, fraudulent invoicing, maybe real estate deals.
And the source notes that certain businessmen are often complicit facilitating this process.
Organized crime, naturally, operates extensively within this parallel economy, using it to launder profits from activities like drug trafficking, human trafficking, etc.
And that corrupt nexus is presented as key. This is the collusion between powerful figures in politics, administration, and business that allows contracts to be rigged, public funds to be misused, and illicit activities to be shielded from the law.
This creates systemic leakages where national wealth is diverted to a privileged few at the direct expense of the nation and its citizens.
This fundamentally undermines governance, erodes public trust, and perpetuates inequality. The source even cites a World Bank estimate suggesting corruption can reduce a nation's GDP growth by anywhere from 0.5 to 1% annually. That's huge over time.
Clearly, addressing this requires a wide range of comprehensive remedial measures. It's not a single fix problem.
And the source outlines several key remedial measures for tackling this financial corruption head-on. Strengthening anti-corruption mechanisms is first.
What does that involve?
Demanding truly independent anti-corruption agencies, free from political interference, robust whistleblower protection laws so people feel safe reporting wrongdoing, and mandatory public asset declarations for officials to increase transparency.
Enhancing financial oversight and regulation is also crucial.
This means stricter anti-money laundering, AML laws, improving monitoring of high-value transactions, strong KYC, know your customer rules for banks, and much better international cooperation to track illicit financial flows across borders.
It also pushes for promoting digital transactions, maybe through incentives for using cashless systems like UPI in India to create a clearer audit trail.
And significantly upgrading audit and compliance procedures, perhaps even suggesting technologies like blockchain for better, immutable tracking of transactions or assets.
Reforming public finance and taxation is another key area.
Simplifying complex tax systems to close loopholes that enable evasion, implementing genuinely progressive taxation with higher rates on very high incomes and wealth, and improving controls on public spending through strict oversight and perhaps performance-based budgeting linking funds to results.
To tackle the parallel and underground economies directly, the source suggests increasing financial inclusion.
Getting more people into the formal banking system, actively working to formalize informal sectors of the economy through registration drives and incentives, and of course, stronger enforcement with severe penalties for illegal economic activity and enhanced capabilities for enforcement agencies.
Breaking that corrupt nexus requires specific actions, too, aimed at the connections themselves.
Definitely. Campaign finance reform is highlighted limiting large, opaque donations, increasing transparency, maybe even exploring public funding options for elections to reduce reliance on private money.
Improving judicial efficiency with specialized fast-track courts dedicated to economic crimes is also suggested. Justice delayed is justice denied, especially here.
And implementing strong ethics education and codes of conduct for public servants from top to bottom.
Combating organized crime and money laundering specifically needs enhanced law enforcement capabilities.
Better tools, better training, more resources, and again, strong international cooperation. Stronger asset seizure laws to effectively confiscate the proceeds of crime. And promoting public-private collaboration, banks and authorities sharing intelligence, perhaps using AI for fraud detection.
And finally, underlying all of this, promoting transparency and accountability across the board is essential.
Strengthening freedom of information laws to give citizens better access to government records. Expanding e-governance initiatives to reduce face-to-face interactions where bribery can occur. And actively supporting independent watchdogs like the media and civil society organizations who hold power accountable.
The source concludes this section by emphasizing that fixing the financial system isn't about one silver bullet. It's a multifaceted challenge requiring a sustained strategy that addresses the root causes, strengthens the institutional frameworks, and fosters a pervasive culture of transparency and accountability.
Flowing directly from those financial system issues, the source dives into ideas for creating a fairer taxation system.
It starts, interestingly, by looking at the origins of the word taxation itself.
Yeah, from the Latin taxationem, meaning rating or valuing, but also connecting it to the Sanskrit kara, which apparently means hand, suggesting the idea of citizens lending a helping hand to support the nation, a different framing.
It quickly traces the history from ancient taxes like Egypt's grain tax on farmers to the development of metal coins in Lydia, making standardized taxes easier, paper currency in Tang Dynasty China.
The introduction of income tax in Britain in 1799, often driven by war financing needs. Then modern consumption taxes like VAT originating in France in 1954, GST in New Zealand in 1986.
And specifically highlighting India's complex dual GST system introduced in 2017, CGST, SGST, IGST. Examples of high and low taxing countries by tax to GDP ratio are also included for context.
This source then outlines the widely accepted principles of what makes a fair taxation system, drawing on economic theories going back to Adam Smith.
Right, things like equity, both horizontal, people in similar situations pay similar tax, and vertical, those with greater ability to pay more.
Neutrality taxes ideally shouldn't distort economic decisions unnecessarily. Transparency, people should understand how and why they're being taxed. Efficiency, low collection costs for the government, and low compliance costs for taxpayers.
And certainty knowing what tax is due and when. Plus, convenience for the taxpayer in paying. These are the classic benchmarks.
The current system, in many places, including India implicitly, is described as distributed, with multiple agencies involved in collection, and often designed for a pre-digital era.
It notes that the central bank, like the RBI in India, oversees both paper currency, which offers anonymity and thus facilitates black money,
and digital currency, which is inherently traceable, offering potential for reform.
This leads to a key, and again, quite radical proposal from the source, a new centralized tax system that leverages control over currency, particularly targeting paper cash.
Okay, what's the proposal?
The core idea is a hefty 30% tax levied at source on all cash withdrawals from banks, a direct disincentive.
Wow, 30%. That's designed to actively discourage withdrawing large amounts of cash and strongly push people towards digital transactions where things are traceable.
Second, it proposes setting a fixed 10-year validity period for physical currency notes. They expire after a decade.
And when exchanging these old notes in their final year of validity, there would be another 30% tax applied. The source argues that over the decade, this effectively averages out to around a 3% annual tax on holding physical cash. Discourages hoarding.
And third, complementing this, a small flat-rate tax proposed at 0.5% on all digital transactions.
The argument here is that even a tiny rate captures significant revenue from the sheer volume of digital transactions, and since wealthier individuals and businesses tend to transact more frequently and in larger amounts, it would implicitly capture more revenue from them.
This proposed model is presented as greatly simplifying tax collection, making it almost automatic. It aims to significantly reduce evasion by making most economic activity traceable via digital means.
And fundamentally aligning the tax system with the realities of a modern, increasingly digital economy. Supplementary taxes on things like customs duties, luxury items, liquor, and tobacco would likely continue, collected at source, as they often are now.
The advantages highlighted are pretty clear. Massively increased transparency because of the digital trail for most transactions.
Projected revenue growth, the source is optimistic, forecasting potentially significant increases in total tax collection, even citing a hypothetical figure like 19.35 lakh crore for India, though that's speculative.
And a major behavioral shift, actively incentivizing digital adoption across the entire population and economy, moving away from cash.
However, the challenges are also significant and immediately apparent. Equity is a huge one.
That 30% tax on cash withdrawals could disproportionately burden low-income individuals, the unbanked, or those in rural areas who still rely heavily on cash for daily life.
Exactly. Mitigation strategies are suggested, like maybe exemptions for very small withdrawals, or providing digital subsidies or support for low-income users to transition. But it's a serious concern.
Infrastructure is another major challenge, particularly ensuring reliable internet connectivity and banking access in rural or underserved areas to support widespread digital adoption. You can't tax digital if people can't access digital.
And there will undoubtedly be resistance from sectors heavily reliant on cash currently, or from those who benefit from the anonymity of the current system. Managing this transition would require careful planning, incentives, and probably phased implementation.
Despite these significant challenges, the source argues that a well-implemented transaction-based model like this has the potential to generate significantly higher revenues than the current complex system.
While drastically enhancing transparency, curbing corruption related to cash, and truly modernizing the entire taxation framework for the 21st century. It's a bold vision.
The source then briefly touches on the broader evolution of money itself.
From barter to the invention of standardized coins, like those from ancient Lydia, to paper currency, originating in Tang Dynasty China.
It even speculates on future possibilities like smart paper currency embedded with traceable chips to prevent counterfeiting, bridging physical and digital.
And the ongoing rapid move towards purely digital currencies.
On that topic of digital currencies, the source notes the current landscape sees active discussions and development around both decentralized cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin.
And perhaps more significantly for national policy, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs.
It points out that a large number of countries, over 130 according to the source, are currently exploring CBDCs in some form. Some have already launched or are running active pilots, mentioning the Bahamas, Sand Dollar, India, Digital Rupee Pilot, Brazil, and China, Digital Yuan Pilot, as examples.
The stated aims behind CBDCs for central banks are typically cited as increasing efficiency and lowering costs in payment systems, promoting financial inclusion for the unbanked.
Offering new tools for monetary policy implementation, like potentially applying interest rates directly to digital holdings, and perhaps asserting national monetary sovereignty in an age of global digital platforms and private cryptocurrencies.
But the source also flags significant downsides and concerns with CBDCs. Privacy is a major one.
The potential for government surveillance of every single transaction is a huge concern for many people.
Absolutely. There's also the potential for disruption to the existing commercial banking system. If everyone holds their money directly with the central bank, what's the role of commercial banks?
The sheer cost and technical complexity of implementing such a system nationwide is another barrier. Cybersecurity risks become highly centralized and critical.
And the challenge of achieving international coordination for cross-border payments using different national CBDCs is also a significant hurdle.
So, the source suggests a cautious approach to CBDCs is warranted, advocating for thorough pilot programs, extensive public consultation, and careful consideration of the risks before any widespread adoption.
It notes that it's still early days globally, and there's no universal consensus or rush towards full implementation just yet. More watching and learning is needed.
Wow, that really was quite a deep dive into building a just state and society based on this source material, wasn't it? A lot to take in.
It really was. We've traversed a vast landscape of ideas. I mean, from the fundamental importance of reason and these ancient philosophical principles like Dharma and that intriguing microcosm-macrocosm analogy.
All the way through proposed structural reforms for governance and justice systems, strategies for tackling really deep-seated corruption, and even those bold new ways to think about taxation in a digital age.
We look at some truly challenging and frankly unconventional ideas presented in the source, from that multi-tiered governance model based on ancient analogies to the controversial notion of curbing certain types of religious propagation.
And even that brief, complex mention of potentially using non-traditional methods in justice, however questionable their actual efficacy might be.
The source material is clearly drawing from an incredibly wide range of references. We saw connections to Plato and Aristotle, ancient Indian texts like the Rig Veda and Manusmriti.
Significant historical moments in Europe, like the papal bulls and the Reformation, modern research on collective behavior and psychology.
And practical examples from contemporary governments like Estonia's digital systems or Korea's Kippa Institute. It's pulling from everywhere.
It truly makes you pause and consider how these different streams of wisdom, from ancient philosophy to modern science and governance practice, can intersect and inform the incredibly complex challenge of trying to build a better, more just society.
It's clearly not a simple problem with a single easy answer. The source presents a complex tapestry of ideas.
So what does grappling with all this mean for you listening in? It really challenges us, I think, to look beyond the surface-level political debates and the daily headlines.
And consider the deeper principles, the structural ideas, the foundational philosophies that might underpin a genuinely just system. It pushes us to think about the building blocks themselves.
Exactly. And here's a final thought to perhaps leave you with, building on the source's idea of democratic memory and collective consciousness.
If societies, much like individuals, do have some form of collective memory and maybe even a collective identity that shapes their actions and future.
what is our responsibility as participants and citizens within that society to ensure that this collective memory is accurate, that our collective identity is rooted in strong ethical principles, and that our shared consciousness truly serves the pursuit of justice for everyone?
Something to ponder.